He also wants to turn our weaknesses, those things that we hate about ourselves, our weaknesses, he wants to turn them into his strengths. And he wants to turn the negative things that happen to us into his positives. In other words, he wants us to be joyous, victorious people, people of passion. But speaking of negatives, those awful things that happen, and we all have some of those in our lives. For me, the greatest negative in my life was the loss of our fourth child, a newborn baby named Misty. When I was 6 months pregnant, I learned that there was a problem with the pregnancy. The baby had hydrocephalus. And so I had to go for the next couple of months, every week, I had to go several times to the hospital for an ultrasound to see how much of the baby's, this insidious fluid was supplanting the brain tissue in our baby. And I had to be ready at any time to fly to San Francisco for surgery. At that time, they were just beginning to experiment with in utero surgery, and it was still experimental, but they wanted me to be ready to go at any time to have that surgery. Well, then the final diagnosis came in that the baby had a fatal chromosome combination, and we knew that once she was born, she would die. When I first found out there was a problem with the pregnancy, I just felt led to start a journal. Now, I was primarily a fiction writer at that time and writing made-up stories, you know, just coming up with characters and plots and stories, and that was my life. But now I was going to tell my own story. And so I began to keep a journal, and I kept it for what would have been up through Misty's her fifth birthday. And that journal became this book, Misty, Our Momentary Child. And you know, through the years, I've heard from lots of people that book has helped them and blessed them. Women who've lost a child, other people who've lost some other relative have been helped by the book. And you know, whenever somebody tells me that they have been helped, I think to myself, that's another one for you, Misty. You know, you're responsible for that blessing in somebody's life. And if God can use a damaged, unfinished infant who lived for only 2 hours, then he can use any of us. He can use all of us. I'd like to give you a few highlights of my writing life. Some time ago, I was interviewed by Pat Boone on his radio show at his home studio. Now, I don't know about you, but I was born in the 40s, and I grew up in the 50s, and I was crazy about Pat Boone. I love Pat Boone. So when I got invited to his house to have him interview me about one of my books, I was pretty much beside myself. And you can see somewhere over there on that wall over there, there's a picture of Pat and me together. So it was great fun to be on his radio show. I also had the opportunity while I was writing a 6-book series of novels for Thomas Nelson, my Heartland Memories books, which I'll mention a little bit more later. My editor, between books, she would ask me to do nonfiction books for her. So I did a couple of books for some psychologists, marriage psychologists, and then she asked me also to do the biography of country music star Ricky Van Shelton. Some of you may remember him. He was popular back in the late 80s and the early 90s. And I hadn't heard of him at the time, although I did like country music. But anyway, I was invited to do his story. So I got to fly to Nashville and spend almost a week at his Beefalo Ranch there. And then I got to be his guest at his stellar performance at the Mirage Hotel in Las Vegas, and got to go sit there with his wife for the performance, and then got to spend time with him backstage afterwards. I've rubbed shoulders with some famous authors like Nora Roberts and Debbie McComber. Debbie is a really neat lady. Have any of you read her books? She's just a wonderful person. At the Romance Writers of America convention, I got to sit under the instruction of famous authors like Mickey Spillane. Any of you remember Mickey Spillane? The author who created the Mike Hammer mystery series. So I got to be with him, listen to him speak, and teach at the Palm Springs Writers Conference. I also got to hear Ray Bradbury, author of the Martian Chronicles. Got to hear him speak and spend time with him. And there's some pictures of us over there too, along with Pat Boone. And with Harold Robbins and other writers. And that was great fun. I got to spend a week on a cruise ship doing research for a mystery romance novel. I got to interview a lot of the officers and staff and got the information I needed to write my novel. The whole novel takes place on a cruise ship. I had one lady who read the book and told me later, she says, well, I went to Alaska on a cruise too, and I enjoyed your cruise more than mine. So I thought that was a pretty good thing to hear. I also went on a police ride-along through Watts and saw drug deals going down, and that was one of those more scary events in my life, I have to admit. Tyndale House, I did a couple of books with them, and they asked me to write the story of a man named Dr. David Hernandez, a close personal friend of Dr. James Dobson, if any of you have heard of him. And Dr. Hernandez, it was kind of a 3 generations roots saga. It started with his grandparents in Mexico and how they came over to America. And David's grandfather was a bootlegger in Phoenix. And his poverty-stricken parents once lived in a chicken coop in San Jose. But David pulled himself up by his bootstraps and became a brilliant surgeon in Pasadena. He bravely faced the intimate challenge of a terminal illness, but he left a legacy of love and courage for all who knew him. And when I would do work on his book, he didn't want to be away from his family any more than necessary because he knew he was dying of this rare liver ailment. And so we would get together on his vacation time. We would go with him to the beach or on a picnic or wherever, but he always was with his family and his children as we did our research. A little bit about my personal background. I grew up in Jackson, Michigan, in a little house near a sprawling woods. I remember the seasons coming and going outside our picture window, heat-drenching summers, crisp, burnished autumns, blustery winters, bright green springs. I recall a floor model 1940s radio beside an overstuffed chair where I sat listening to Ozzie and Harriet, to Big John and Sparky. Any of you remember any of these? And to big band era melodies. Now, my father was a jazz musician. His father before him was a jazz pianist. And my other grandfather he played in a marching band. So there was a lot of music in our family. My dad played saxophone and clarinet, and he toured the country with various bands back in the late 30s and the early 40s. My mother is still with us. She is 97 years old. She lives back in Jackson, Michigan, in our childhood home. And at 97, she is still painting, and she videotapes herself doing instructional videos, and then she edits the videos and puts them on YouTube. And she has hundreds and hundreds of videos on YouTube and thousands of followers. Even though she had brain surgery about a year ago, she has recovered and she is back at work painting again. My father looked like Dick Powell, and my mother like Merle Oberon or Veronica Lake, or some of those old-time movie stars. They were two of the most handsome people I had ever seen. Unlike them, I was plain-faced, awkward, and shy. But they gave me a great love for the arts, writing, drawing, painting, and music. From my mother, I learned to become a woman of passion, and I wrote a book by that name. It's here somewhere. It's here. You'll see it on some of the other some of the tables here somewhere. But I wanted women to discover the joyous person that God created them to be. Several years after my father died, my mother, at the age of 85, ran off to Las Vegas and married the man of her dreams, a dashing multi-millionaire, also 85. And I said to my mom, I said, okay, it's all right if you want to run off to Las Vegas and get married, as long as you don't get married by an Elvis impersonator. I drew the line to that. Well, she didn't. She got married in a nice little wedding chapel. And if any of you hear any of the little accents here from the front row, that's my foster granddaughter. And she might add a few comments as we go along. But John and my mom had known each other most of their lives, and they had comforted each other when their mates died. And eventually they fell madly, passionately in love. And talk about being a woman of passion. Ladies, it's never too late. Never, never. And if you want to look my mother up and see some of it, she has about 500 paintings for sale on eBay. And if you want to see some of her videos, look her up. Millie Gift Smith. She kept the gift in her name too. I want to share a little bit about how I came to write the Heartland Memories series. There are 6 books. This is the first one, The House on Honeysuckle Lane. And I wanted to capture what the world was like during my mother's generation of the 30s and the 40s, and what mine was like during the 50s and the 60s. And I was always intrigued by my grandmother Gift's old Victorian house built in 1900 in Marion, Indiana. It became, in a sense, the main character of my series. My series focuses on 2 families that live around the corner from each other, the Reeds and the Herricks, in the imaginary town of Willowbrook, Indiana. Now, there is no Willowbrook, Indiana, if you look it up, but it's kind of a composite of my hometown of Jackson, Michigan, and my grandmother's hometown of Marion, Indiana. And I wanted to capture what life was like from the 1920s through the 1970s. So each book is told from the viewpoint of a different woman who lived in the house on Honeysuckle Lane during one of those decades. I did a huge amount of research for these books, and some of you, quite a few of you, have read some of these books, and you've told me, "Oh, you did so much research." Yeah, I did. I had a book, a 1940s book that covered World War II day by day. I could go anywhere in that book and pick out a day and tell you exactly what happened in World War II on that particular day. Fascinating book. And then our family, Bill and I tend to, we just collect things and never get rid of them. And my family was kind of that way too, especially Bill's parents. They had a lot of old magazines that they had saved, Life and Look, from the 50s and the 60s. And they had some wonderful magazines that captured the Kennedy administration and the assassinations. And so that was very helpful. And then my dad had a whole stack of old downbeat magazines for musicians. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but that was very helpful in creating some of the musicians in my story. Of course, I had to have artists, writers, and musicians in my story because those are all my favorite things. The best thing that happened when I started my research, just as I was plotting book 1, I went to a garage sale back in my hometown in Jackson. We loved going to garage sales. So we went to this garage sale, and here was a box of old, musty newspapers that the people in this house had replaced the linoleum floor in their house, in the kitchen. They had taken up the old linoleum, and underneath that old linoleum was padded with all these old yellowed newspapers from 1939 and 1940, my hometown newspaper. And that was just an amazing find for me because I was able to read these old newspapers and capture so much of what life was like in 39 and 40. And I mean, they had everything, you know, all kinds